last night we briefly went over the coming out in a family, and if you look at a family, the way people come out, it occurs in 3 waves. You have this nice little family, and the gay or lesbian spouse comes out, having struggled, worked it through for a long, long time until he or she's comfortable with who he or she is and is able to acknowledge it and say it for whatever consequences there are. Well, then the straight spouse gets all this information for the first time and has to process it through and is going through exactly the same struggle, but of course is light years behind the gay spouse. And then the 2 of them get comfortable enough to tell the children. And then the children have to start going through their processing of whatever age they are. At the same time, they're trying to grow up. And one of the young men I interviewed said, you know, growing up is hard enough, but to have the gay thing to handle with is a bit much. Now, he's fine now with it, but they're both processes, and I think we forget that. The coming out is not, boom, that's it. But the gay person will change in the next 2 or 3 years, and the lesbian person will change, and the straight person will change, and they'll be changing together, and it's an ongoing process. And I think that's where a lot of spouses get caught, because they think this is it, and this is what's going to happen, or this is it, and this is what isn't going to happen, rather than trying to let time and the process of getting through a crisis, because it's similar to any crisis, let that take care of, not of itself, but to let it work and not work against it. It's like trying to paddle upstream. I mean, just, you don't necessarily go with the flow, but you make use of what's happening just through natural regeneration. So the 6 things you remember last night, that everyone deals with. I mean, you could just say, well, the gay one deals with his or her sexuality. What happens to the marriage? What will happen to my kids? Who am I? If I'm a very strong Muslim or Catholic or Methodist, you know, what does it mean to my moral values? And what about my belief system? Well, then the spouse goes through the same thing. You know, who am I? What about our sexuality? Have I been rejected as a woman or a man? Can I live with a non-traditional marriage if that's what it takes? Can my husband become monogamous, or my wife if that's what it takes? What about the children? How can I help them if I'm dealing with this issue? Who am I? Even the most liberal spouse I know feels all upset when they discover, oh my goodness, my husband or wife is gay or lesbian. Because we've heard throughout society, whether we're conservative or liberal, we always know there's a stigma attached to being gay or lesbian. Hopefully that will not be true in 10 or 20 years, but even after Stonewall, it's still true. So the moral values, and also the deception we mentioned yesterday or last night. The straight spouse feels deceived, and the gay spouse, having been closeted and felt guilty and put a lot of self-blame on, has gone through the process of wondering about moral values. I'm an honorary member of the Husbands Out to Their Spouses by Married Men of America, and Spouses Out to Their Spouses, and this issue comes up every year. You know, how can I make this work with the way I've been brought up in my religion, particularly? So this is an issue. And then the whole belief system. Well, what is true? What can I believe in? Where can I find meaning if all of this has been devastated by the coming out? Because the coming out blows apart all the concepts we ever had about who a man is, who a woman is, what relationships are like, what a marriage should be like, who's going to be saved and not saved, what's right and what's wrong. So you can see the problem that I think many people don't see. You've got the husband or wife doing this, then the new straight spouse, and then the kids. Therefore, it takes a long time. So what are the stages? I'm going to focus mainly on the straight spouse right now, because I think we know and we've read, and there's lots of material on the gay or lesbian. And then I'll put a little bit about the children. The first The news is shocking, even though you may have suspected. When you hear it, it is shocking. It's a surprise. It is devastating. Now the next level is, and I know most of you are familiar with it because even the gay person goes through it. Oh, it can't be true. I mean, yeah, maybe he likes men today, but maybe he still likes me. And a lot of guilt. What did I do? I mean, maybe if I'd been sexier, he wouldn't have turned to men. A lot of women tell me that. Or the man will say, well, maybe if I'd been more assertive, or maybe if I'd been less macho or something, she wouldn't have turned to women. And even intellectually, if you know it isn't possibly true, most spouses go through their marriages once again and say, it must have been me. Because a lot of marriages will have, up to this point, both spouses will say something was missing. I knew something was missing, I didn't know what it was. And even if intellectually, now that you know the truth, you think, oh my gosh, maybe, what if I'd done this? And you can be crazy. In fact, I think I almost drove myself crazy at one point, wondering that. Time itself, as life in the family changes. I'm assuming that the gay or lesbian person who comes out really wants to, not necessarily go out and have a lifetime partner, but at least wants to go to gay bars or lesbian bars or socialize or join the gay fathers group or go to the lesbian women's group. So life does change. The social schedule changes. And after a while, just living with this new life, which is different from what you had before, the straight spouse gradually has reality forced upon him or her. Well, there are two ways to handle it. I have both of them up there. You can either face the reality and say, okay, this is what it's like, or you can continue to deny it. And there are three things to face. One is, this person now identifies himself or herself with a different sexual orientation. That's one piece of reality that you can't change. Another one is, you are really hurt, and the family's really disrupted, and you can't change that either. And the third is, what was is no longer there. So there are three pieces of reality. And the more you can, that I've noticed, the more spouses can live with those three things, and work through them, the smoother sailing there is on the other side. But it's a long, dark tunnel to have to go through. Caitlin in the book, for example, she would go visit her husband and his new lover in their house while they were eating dinner, just to impress upon herself that he really did have another lover. Somebody last night said, somebody kept telling her story, telling her his story over and over and over again. You do that just to make it come true, not make true, but to make it sink in that this really did happen. Then the next step is, okay, you're facing it. Two ways to handle it. One is to try to understand it, and you never can completely. Change can never really be understood. Or again, keep denying. And if you're working with spouses and you're working with your spouse, if you're a sport group leader or a psychologist, or if you're the gay spouse waiting for the straight spouse to come with it, you have to be with them, and that's where they need their hands held. Yes, it is painful to understand those things. I mean, after all, this is who I am. Why don't you understand? But you can't get it through your head that this spouse is now someone different. One man in his survey to me, he came out at 50, I believe. And he said the first thing to do, now this is the gay man, the first thing to do is to know that your marriage is the way it was is over, so get your grieving with right away. I don't know if that's the best advice, but it was interesting that he felt that was the stumbling block in his wife's wanting to cling to what was. That doesn't mean the marriage can't continue, but you want not to cling to what was, because it isn't. I'm putting all the negative stuff first, just bear with me. Just bear with me. There's Kleenex around here. Then you can accept this. And I don't think the anger that comes yet. You can accept it, and once you accept it, which is what I've found, that's when the anger comes out. Because if you accept it, then you get angry about it. But accepting doesn't necessarily mean accepting, well, okay, I'm letting go of all my anger. But the accepting, you can avoid it, you can anger, you can accept it. Then after you accept it, then, okay, the anger's out, you fought it, you finished fighting it. Then the choice seems to be, as I've talked to spouses, not that you make a choice, but you can grieve and forgive. Or you can just despair and say it's all over. Because despair is stopping the process. But if you can grieve and forgive, and I'll get into forgiveness later, then, and only then, I think, can you start to heal. Because there you are, you're wounded, it's no longer the way it was, you've accepted it, so all you have to do is all that's left is to help take care of yourself. And the interesting thing is, the more the straight spouse takes care of himself or herself, the better the relationship is, because the spouse is taking care of. When you take care of yourself, you're not depending on somebody else to do it. And many of the gay and lesbian spouses just sort of breathe a sigh of relief when they say, I'm not responsible anymore. I'll take care of myself, she'll take care of herself. And then they can rebuild their relationship. And the couples that have done that have often been able to stay together, or at least have a positive relationship if they decide the best thing for both of them is to divorce. And then the reconstruction period, and I say that rather than rebuilding, because rebuilding almost sounds as if you're rebuilding something. Well, reconstructing is you've got a whole new blueprint. You're starting off with a whole new foundation of your new beliefs, new moral values that you've had to work out in order to survive, and you build. And I usually call this stage changing from being a victim to being a victor in your own life. So that if you don't reconstruct, you keep on staying the victim. And I'm sure in your support groups, and whether you're in a gay married men support group, I know a lot of married men support groups are full of angry men, and they themselves have not even accepted the fact and been able to rebuild and find peace. We had lunch the other day, Sarah and I, with a gay man who is still married, and after the teenage period of running around the candy shop and being out there and so forth, he said, being gay is no longer an issue. It's part of me now. I'm at peace. So, but this process, Jackie and I were talking about that last night, usually takes about 3 years. So if you can hang in there, one can get through. Okay, so now I'll tell you how people seem to have been able to get through the stages. I mentioned last night about Dan, who was able to start rebuilding all of him by becoming a triathlete. I want to read you a little bit from a woman who did it a different way. She went to a workshop. She had been to a therapist who had tried to make her free associate about her father, which was not very relevant. And she'd gone to another support group, and it was a women's support group, and they went around the circle identifying what their problems were, and they came to her, and she said, well, my husband's gay. And the leader said, oh, okay, next. So she was pretty down on therapists and groups, but she did go away for a long, and she moved actually to a retreat center. And she went to a workshop called Liberation from Within. Remembering my negative experiences with therapy, I went to the first meeting with all my defenses up. Though I acted carefree and self-assured, I was trembling inside. The group was small, 7 or 8 women with 2 leaders who were kind, gentle, and intelligent. As they made me feel safe, I relaxed my guard. One of our first exercises was, "Who are you?" Separated into pairs, we were to ask our partner gently, over and over, "Who are you?" The idea was to uncover the richness and diversity of our identity. My partner began, "Who are you?" "Jane." "Who are you?" she asked again. I had no answer. "Who are you?" She prodded gently. "I don't know." I whispered and began to cry. Took her 3 years there just to get in touch with herself. As I mentioned last night, she is now a minister. She found the only way to get meaning was to find the spiritual part of herself, which was bigger than herself. And that way she was able to find meaning. And she and her husband are best of friends now. They always have been. As she says in the end, although the marriage is dissolved, we continue to hold the vows sacred. Now another image of the kind of relationship you can end up having if you go through all of this. This is the story by a lesbian who married, and her family was delighted because it was a very traditional Jewish family, and she was marrying a nice Jewish boy, and they have a nice Jewish family, and so forth and so on. And it was really quite good, but something was a little amiss. And just before the wedding, she sort of met an old friend of hers who happened to be a woman, and they had a little affair. Even at the wedding, there was something that happened in the women's room, and so, but she couldn't bear the thought of even thinking she might possibly be lesbian. Couldn't possibly. Well, eventually she went to school, she had some therapy, and she thought maybe she was. So she crept into her husband's room one night and said, "I really have something to tell you." And he said, "Well, I have something to tell you too." So she came out to him, and he came out to her. They double dated for 4 years. They dared not be out in the world or separate. For 4 years they stuck together. And finally, her lover said, "Look, it's him or me." And she said, "I better get out." But the end of her story, I think, is probably a key to a lot of the problems those of us in this room have encountered. My life would have been different if gays and lesbians were allowed to play the flirtation and mating games of adolescence. Part of me feels that it would have been terrible because I wouldn't have met Scott, as dear to me as any of my close friends. I can't imagine marrying anyone but him. The feel of his hand 19 years ago made him an immediate choice, absolutely normal. On another level, where I am today and who I am is the right choice for me. I mean, the whole thing is such a tragic situation of people struggling to be who they are, and hopefully we won't have these situations before, but if you realize that both in a family, and if you're in a relationship, it's no longer coming out by yourself. You're coming out in a family. It's a family affair. So if you can sort of tune into this tumult that everyone's facing, don't worry if you get angry or cry. It's that kind of a situation. Then we get some children experiences. This is a child who was the perfect child. Her father adored her. Her brother came along and he could have cared less, so that when he came out, the father came out and left, the older child had to continue to be perfect, or she might lose him too. And children do this. If the divorce thing, as I mentioned last night, is such an abandonment issue that if there's any chance that you're going to lose either of the other parents, you do everything to either be perfect or act out to get attention, one or the other. There's a woman in my support group and had 4 children. Her daughter was a teenager, she got pregnant. The older child crashed the car. They just they had to do something to be brought in. So this child, she passed out one day for some kind of peculiar vascular problem. But she was all right. She went driving with a friend of hers who didn't have a license in their family car that had no treads on the tires in a rainy night, you know, things like that. Just trying to control it. I interviewed her afterwards, and she said, we weren't the normal family, and I didn't want anyone to know that. So her brother, in the meantime, really could care less, except one day he was talking with friends on the playground after school, and an older boy said, "Hey, did you know that Nikki's dad is gay?" The children next to him said, "What a jerk, who cares?" His best friend didn't even respond, but Nicholas was upset. When one of his friends got home and told his mother what had happened, they returned to the playground, found Nicholas hysterical, and brought him home. They stayed until he calmed down. His friend was still there when I came home. Nicholas didn't want to go to school the next day, so I offered to drive him. "Mom, I'm so afraid. I don't want my friends to hate me." "See if you can go to school knowing it's Hal's problem," I said. "He seems to think so little of himself that he makes others look bad in order to look better. Ignore him. Your classmates will. If you don't let on that it upsets you, nothing will happen." "I'll try." As we drove to school, I said, "If the worst should happen, I'll pick you up after school so you don't have to be alone." No one said a word to him about it that day or since, nor did he ever mention the subject to any of his friends. So the parent is there. Children are fearful, but the parent can be there to support. If the parent herself or himself has gone through it, understands, and is paying attention to the child. One of the key things that comes through in all the conversations I've had now is if you can just focus on what's happening now, rather than build in all these fears of what might happen and what used to be and blah, blah, blah. Just focus on making the child secure and yourself secure, and be kind and respectful of the other person. It will work out. I know that's asking a lot. Now this is the family, and this is another, and I'm bringing up these examples to show how other people can help the family, whether it's the mother helping the child in this case, or in this next case, the law, a judge helping the family. This is the family where the mother said, gave the father a choice of being gay or get out. And in order for her to find structure, she went to rather than reconstructing her value system, she went back to her childhood religion, which was very, very, very strict. And it was easy for her to get control in her life by being very strict. So this man was evil for being gay. And she would make it very difficult for the children to visit him. I mean, she would send them on the custody issues with their suitcase was filled with little notes from her and little gifts so that they wouldn't forget her. She was afraid. It's a fearful thing. But rather than trust a dad's love for the kid, she was doing this. So it was quite difficult. And toward the end, she wasn't even being allowed to go. So finally, the father found this. He lived in an area where there was a gay fathers group, and so the gay fathers gave him advice, and they found a legal aid advice for him so that he could go to court and say, "Look, you're not living up to the custody. I want to see these children." They had a psychological examination. They found out that the mother was really troubled psychologically. She's the one that I said that her anger was trying to keep tied to this father in some way by anger. And she was the one, everyone else seemed to be fine, but she was not doing too well. So finally, they went to court, the psychiatrist made his report, and then the court made the ruling, and they lowered the, she was demanding crazy amounts of custody payments. That didn't work out, so they had to go back to the court. Once more, I went to the Detroit courthouse, this time to take Patty to court for contempt. When the judge sat Patty, the children, and me down in the chambers with George, that was her second husband, who in the back of the courtroom before had stood up and said, I don't want my children with somebody who's going to get AIDS. This was the atmosphere of the children. And George was sitting in the back. The judge addressed Jeff and Peggy, those are the children. I do not accept your disregard for the laws and constitution of this state and the legal processes of the courts. Turning to Patty, he said, it's your responsibility to ensure that the children comply fully to Frank's rights for visitation. Then he looked the children in the eye and he said, I never want to see you in this courtroom again. You have responsibilities and rights and a father who loves you. The court has spoken. Good lawyer, and you can't always find judges like that, but it is something that we have to keep in mind. The parent-child bond is one of love, and the children have a right and responsibility to be loving children to their father and let their father love them, or their mother. Still with the children in this. This is the family I mentioned last night. The father came out, he's a very high-powered lawyer. The children stayed in the family house and the parents came and went. The daughter, I think I mentioned, had slashed her wrists and she was having a hard time with her anger. She didn't mind her father was gay, he had less time for them, but she couldn't control the situation. Nothing's been easy, she said. This is the end of her interview with me, or her story. Nothing's been easy, but the one good thing is that Dad's coming out made me more open-minded. I feel worlds ahead of my peers. I take people for who they are. Their race or religion or sexual preference doesn't matter. It's what's inside that counts. Dad's being gay doesn't bother me, except when he's drunk at the pool in the morning. It took courage to come out with 3 kids, a wife, and a business. I admire him for that, and I hope I will be like him. But I'm tired of keeping this secret, very tired. Since this is my senior year and I no longer care what people think, I don't want to keep it any longer. But I also don't want to put it on my younger brothers coming up from the lower grades. I can't wait for college. I can keep my mouth shut for that freedom. She had not told her mother this. I mean, this was the value of this outside person to which he was talking, but I'm sharing it with you so you know what's going inside the children, who may seem to be taking it well and may not be, or seem to be not taking it well and they really are. Acting out and being perfect is a way to cope. They're just not shoving it down. Then another example of conflict between the parents affecting the children. These are the 2 women whose mother had a lover and they would run around the house hiding everything when their friends came over to play. They told nobody till they were 20. But they could, they would go, and they did have visitation rights and they lived nearby. At my father's house, we couldn't mention Mom's name in front of him because it would set him off. If we'd done something with her, we said we'd done what we'd done, but we didn't say we'd done it with her. Though we lived in the house he'd left, we couldn't call it home. When we went home, we'd say, bye, Dad, we're going to Graham Street now. Every time one of my friends met my father for the first time, I said, he hates my mother. Don't mention her name in front of him or he'll blow up. I didn't say it would make him talk about her sexuality. Mom's sexuality was at the root of Dad's horrendous outbursts. He'd say, "Your mother's a lesbian." With such disgust, I figured it must be the worst thing he could say. Then he'd add, "Wait till you're old enough to understand what your mother did." I knew she was a woman, but at 13, couldn't understand her sexuality. Yet every time Dad said, "Your mother's a blank lesbian," I felt such absolute rage, I swore back and left. Then her sister's telling me, at 11, I couldn't understand that this man was hurt by his ex-wife and that unloading on an 11-year-old wasn't appropriate. Joan and I had no dialogue to deal with it. We didn't know how to say, "Dad, look what you're doing to us. How do you think that makes us feel?" So there was much blowing up and crying. They were telling me this when they were 20, looking back. But these little snippets, I'm not doing it to tell you how horrible it is, but these are natural reactions, and we're the parents, and we're the ones to make it easier for the children. I get very upset at this, sorry. And this is the last story of the children, and I'll get back to the spouses. This child actually was quite a brilliant child, kind of genius type. But she didn't know how to handle it except to take care of her younger sister. I mentioned her last night. But I want to go through the sequence so that you can see what happened and how she handled it. At school, going through the trials of puberty, I felt alienated. I had few friends and was teased for being a hermit or dressing weird. Most of the time I was happy to go off in a corner and read. Books were the one thing I loved. They were beautiful things. Sometimes I fought and was beat up on my 13th birthday. I told nobody about my father. If I spoke of him at all, I cried. At one point, someone introduced me to two boys who had a gay father, but one was 17 and couldn't be seen talking to a 13-year-old, and the other was younger than my sister, and I was not going to play with a crummy little boy. I wanted attention, and I wasn't getting it. I also needed to talk with someone. In the 8th grade, I went to see a counselor. "Come back later," he said. So I used the ploy learned from my parents: to get what you want, do something drastic. "But I'm in a hunger strike," I said. "Okay, I'll see you." When I told my counselor about Dad, he said, "Oh," leaned back and clammed up. Afterwards, he avoided me. She spent all of 8th grade not having the counselor there to listen even. I never invited people over to my house, afraid Mom would be home. This is her mother who well, you'll see. I didn't want her acting like a teeny bopper in front of my friends when she was my mother, once a responsible adult. One day that spring, though, I decided to have 3 good friends over so I could tell them about my father. As we munched chips on the porch, I said, "My dad is gay." They were very quiet. And then they went home. They never mentioned it again. It was like the afternoon never happened. This is something you avoid saying something about. I thought, ashamed of my Abba. That was her father. She got to high school, and on the way to high school, which was a different neighborhood and so forth, on the way to high school, someone in front of her said something about a fag. She hauled off and socked him. Knew that by the time she got to the school, the word would spread through the school, so she went around telling everyone. By the end of that day, she said, "I was saying it with pride by the end of the day. Say, folks, my father's gay." And then she said, well, and they'd say, "Oh," and that was it. And then I figured it out. The school had the top % of kids in the city. They were interested in the idea of somebody having a gay parent. Many asked, "Well, how did you get here?" I came up with snappy answers. "Well, the stork." But it took, all this time, and she's a fine young woman now. So we worry, we do worry, and it is worrisome, but they handle it, I think, better than we do, generally. I want to stop with 2 examples of spouses how they come through the stages, and then answer questions. Last night I told you a story, and I'll just briefly say this is the man who, the Hispanic who was the first person in his school to graduate from high school and then college and then graduate school with his PhD. He's a very high-powered State Department official right now in one of the states. But at home, he was so intent, as it often happens, in doing all these things rather than take care of his identity, that it never came out until he broke down. And he did come out, but he never kept his promises. The woman's been struggling with a lot of spirituality classes, human potential classes, trying to take care of herself and still be a great mom to their 4 children. She went to this one class, and it was a poetry class. And they said, write a poem. She took the pen and for 10 minutes wrote, and this is what came out. The husband, love of my life, best friend, lover, betrayer, who professed great love and eternal union, who took a gamble with life, who took a gamble with love, who chose to marry a woman who could only love a man, who fathered children and shattered lives, a wonderful educator, a loving father, an uncaring spouse, driven by ambition, consumed by guilt, still haunted by his secrets, a chameleon of the 90s. And then on the other hand, we have this man on the internet, maybe some of you had read it, who gave me permission to read this letter to his wife. Jackie may have read it, I'm not sure. I started this letter to you last week on the day you picked up your clothes and moved out, but because of so many other things in my life, I did not have the time or strength to finish it till today. I know that you are scared. I know that you wonder if you have done the right thing. I know that you care for me, and I know that you would make things different if you could. But my love, we all do things we can. We all make the best choices that we know how to make at the time. Sometimes they're good ones, sometimes they are not. And sometimes there are some things in which we have no say at all, and it is just a matter of dealing with what life offers us. But knowing you as I do, I know in my heart that you do not make these choices lightly. I know that for the most part they are out of your control. I know that you are strong and smart and kind and caring, and you have struggled your whole life to make sense of this world. And if anyone deserves happiness, it is you. If anyone can make sense of it, you can. If I believed in God and heaven, you would surely have a place there, for in my eyes you wear angels' wings already. My sweet girl, do not feel sorrow at our parting. Rejoice in what we have been allowed to share. Weep with joy at the love that we have known. My time with you has been the best. I am honored to call you my friend. I am grateful for the moments we have spent together. I am blessed by your touch, and I will never forget how it felt to hold you in my arms, what it meant to kiss you, what it was like to feel you lying next to me in the night. Anyone who has had the privilege to be close to you will be better for it, and I know that I am a better person for having known you. You have taught me how to live. You have helped me to be what I am. You have enriched me beyond comprehension, and that is a debt that I will owe until I die. You may wonder, as will the others who might read this, why I should choose to write a letter of this type to you and then publish it on the internet for all the world to see. I have thought about it greatly. It is actually quite simple. Energy never dies. It only changes form. The words that I write to you now upon my clicking the send button will be transformed into waves of energy which will span the globe. They will be received by people in England, Australia, Alaska, California, Maine, Texas, countless other places and points in between. Some will read it in its entirety. Some will see what it is and hit delete. Some will not even open it when they see that it is not for them. Some may cry like I am doing as I write this. Some will not. Some will just shake their heads in wonder. One or two may even hit print. But no matter what, upon reading it, upon deleting it, upon the very act of receiving it, the love that I have for you will forever become a part of each place it visits, each home it enters, each heart it touches. As it races through telephone lines, under the ocean, across the sky, bounces from satellite to satellite, it will leave a little trail of neutrinos like the tail of a comet through the midnight sky. And what we have shared together, you and I, will live forever throughout the universe. Long after I have left this world to other star-crossed lovers, my declaration for you will forever exist, spreading itself through space, traveling to the sun and beyond. No matter where you go, my love will be there, waiting for you, to hold you, to caress you, to comfort you. Goodbye, my wife. Hello, my friend. I love you. I guess I just want to share that with you. We've probably no time for questions. We have Kleenexes here. We have Kleenexes all over the place. He would love it. He would love you to have that. Took a lot of work to get there, but I told you I'd end up with something hopeful. I know, well, it is hopeful. Well, it is. I mean, I think you cry when there's release and you can see the whole picture. Good time for a break. I think a break. I don't think we want any questions. There's plenty of time for questions. I've only got one. One what? Lesbian, straight combination. Oh, Bob. Right. Right. Good. Perfect. Oh. All right. Well, see, I mean, I've got the whole shebang, but. All right.
I don't suppose you're lesbian for coming? No.
On rye? Yes. On rye?
I was happy to be one for a while.
Are we ready? Okay. We're changing our little schedule here, folks, and we're going to take a little less time on this. It's 1:15, so we'll be till 2:15 and then, or 2:10 or something. Then Bill and I are going to do our dialogue, and then the children will be arriving at 3 exactly. Okay, that sounds good.
I hope so.
This is the chart from last night for those who weren't here. The kinds of things that, whether the husband comes out as gay or bisexual, or the wife comes out as lesbian or bisexual, these are pretty much across the board, but there are some differences I'll get into. Communication, as we were explaining in the hall there, is usually you think of communication as just talking, but what the spouses who I've been interviewing now for 3 years, and I've heard from close to 200, say it's not just talking, it's the other one listening and letting the straight spouse or the gay spouse be angry and not becoming defensive and not trying to explain, letting them vent. It's listening and questioning until you think you understand, and then the next day saying it again to make sure, and the next day saying it again. People don't hear the first time. If it's changing paradigms and shifting this cognitive dissonance to understanding, you have to hear it over and over again in different ways and in different things, but without badgering. So communication isn't the usual, oh yeah, work on your communication skills. It's quite a long process. The honesty has to do both with the husband or wife who comes out being honest about how they feel, even though they know it hurts. Don't protect the spouse from hurting, because that's not being honest. You've got to be honest. But it's also the straight spouse being honest about, I hurt, without the gay spouse saying, well, I didn't mean to. I hurt. So it's honesty on both sides. Honesty about what you need, what you want, and how you feel. This is what the spouses were telling me. I'm not telling you. I'm their spokesperson. The thing that seems to work, that came through so often, as you'll hear a little bit later, is that it always ends up being just the couple. No matter how unfavorable the community, no matter how hostile family and friends, no matter how rigid the church, no matter how supportive the friends are, it all boils down to the couples. And over they'd say, we worked it out together. We both compromised. And I know a lot of friends of couples who try to stay together often criticize the straight spouse for compromising, as if that's a horrible thing to do. Well, compromise doesn't mean compromising your values. It means give and take, try this, try that. So I'm trying to think of a better word.
Collaborate.
Well, that's true too. That is true too, but it's the giving up that people don't like to hear. But both sides give up. One gay husband said, she gave up sex, physical sex, I gave up having a lover. So he has a gay social life but no lover, and they cuddle in bed. But they each gave up a little so they could at least be there together, connected physically and emotionally. And physically, but not sexually. So, but he was so, and he's the one that also said, if in fact you can't make this work, treasure what you had. And I like that. You aren't losing anything. You had it and you have it. Time is not only letting the process take place, because it takes a long time, but it's giving the other spouse time to work it through and space to work it through. Some spouses separate so they can think it through without the other person being there. Sometimes it's a matter of making time, and sometimes you get it by accident. A professor had a sabbatical when he came out to his wife. So there was time there that they could make time. If your children are older and out of the house, it's easier to make time. Some spouses make it a point that they have a check-in time once a week. So like they make sure that once a week they have an hour just to check on each other and how they're doing. How are you doing now? Do you have anything you want to say? Others will make a point of once a week having a date. So they go off somewhere else in a neutral spot and just have a good time together. They don't want to talk about the gay issue at all. Just have fun. Let's go out and do anything just to have fun together. Remind each other that we were friends and had fun. So that's what the time element is. Individual responsibility. One couple keeps saying, we listen, but we don't take on the other person's pain. We empathize with it, but we don't feel responsible for it. And that's the key. They think that's the key to how they worked it out. Each person is different, but it's helpful. But each one takes responsibility for working. Because so often, we straight spouse women, particularly, try to make it work. We're supposed to fix everything. And you can't do that. So the other person has to take responsibility. And if the other person hurts you, one of the things that I hear most from straight spouses is the other spouse never apologized for hurting me. They'd like them to say, yeah, I know I hurt you, sorry, I didn't mean to. But they're waiting for that other side to come through. Understanding has to do with the other person's point of view. And if you don't, I guess what usually happens, if you don't really understand the other point of view, rather than say, well, you're crazy or that blah, 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 is just say, well, can you explain it some more? It's that understanding. And without understanding, you never get to the acceptance stage. And then mutual respect is all of these things are platitudes. You hear them all the time, but it really means you respect the other person's point of view as being a valid one for that person. May not be for you, but that respect. Let me tell you how these commonalities play out. And there are differences between a gay husband and a bisexual husband coming out, between the two of them, and between both of them and a lesbian wife and a bisexual wife coming out, and between the two of them. Because there are interesting differences, and I think they have a lot to do with gender. Now, I'm telling you just that you're the first people to hear this part of my research, so it's tentative, and I can't really explain why I haven't really worked it out, but it's something to think about. in common for everybody, gay, straight, lesbian, and bisexual, is the communication, the honesty, taking time, and taking time. Oh, those are the only three. The differences, I'll start with, since there are more bisexual, gay, heterosexual combinations here, I'll start with them. The similarities among them are the communication, the therapy, and love. Now, I'm not saying that the lesbians and the gay, lesbian, and bisexual women don't love, but that does not seem to them to be a factor in why they stayed together. They assume it's there. It's not an active factor for their coping. It's not there. And space for each other. Interestingly enough, bisexual husbands have not found therapy to be that helpful, and that's probably because many therapists don't know how to handle bisexuality. Fewer wives of gay men found that honesty was helpful in coping because more of them that answered the interview had divorced, and it was the honesty factor that seemed to be more important to them. I'm not saying bisexual husbands are more honest, but it was more of concern if it's gay versus straight, which is a very polarized picture. Somehow or other, the honesty issue makes it more difficult to be honest, because for many straight spouses, I am gay or I am lesbian just seems to say, okay, then you're out of the picture. Whereas bisexuality sounds more as if there's more possibilities. I'm just giving you these notions because when you're talking with your spouses, what you say is the first thing they pay attention to. And so one has to be very careful of how one says things. In fact, it's probably better not to come out and say I'm gay or bisexual. It's better to come out and say, you know, I think I like men or I think I like women. Because sometimes putting the label on it gets people frozen into a certain attitude rather than, you know, I think I'm attracted to the same sex. Lesbian and the lesbian and bi women, when they come out, more of them seem to find support groups helpful than the heterosexual spouses and bisexual spouses on the male-female side, probably because there are more of them. It's harder to find bisexual groups. All of the lesbian and bi women and their husbands find the supportive circumstances for staying together being money, children, and religion, and love. Now for them, love is one of the reasons they stay together. It's not the coping strategy. And it may be because it's the lesbian and bisexual women coming out, and women are more likely to be more expressive of their love than the men. I don't know, but it's very interesting. But for the gay and bisexual men and their wives, love is a coping strategy. You want to show your love, and if you show your love physically to your wife will more easily believe that you want to stay married or you want to have a good relationship. Among the circumstances for the gay husband and bisexual husband that are common across the board is we do it ourselves, the wife is the primary relationship, our friends support us, support groups support us, finances, our love, children, jobs, religion, and we enjoy our sexuality. Was it you who asked me the question last night? I think it was. What's the difference between having a bisexual husband and a gay husband? A bisexual husband or a bisexual wife is more likely to be still sexually in contact with the spouse. However, now here's where we get into labels. Men who call themselves a gay married men oftentimes still have sex with their wives and they say, I am gay short of one woman. And lesbians will say, I am lesbian short of one man. So it doesn't matter what they say. The point is how the straight spouse feels and how much sex they have. But it does, that sexuality issue is one of the most difficult, probably even more difficult than the monogamy issue. However, George DeBille did a study of about 30 couples who were still together, described as gay married men. And the women felt maritally satisfied as long as they were caressed, cuddled, physically, not necessarily sex. And that wasn't a compromise. This is what they wanted. This was part of the marriage. This was part of the person. External factors. One of the things I'm asking in my research right now is, all right, how did you cope? What circumstances were helpful, supportive, and what factors got in the way? What would you think is the biggest factor that makes it difficult to stay married?
Third person.
That is one of them, but it's not the most often mentioned. Repeat the question? Oh, I'm sorry. Will you a third person, the lover, that is one of the key ones, but it's not the key one. Thank you. Disease is rarely mentioned. Out of 127 reforms I've looked at right now, AIDS is mentioned maybe 3 times, and sexually transmitted disease is maybe twice. Lack of positive social support for homosexuality, for mixed orientation marriages, for non-traditional marriages. Whether you hear it from hostile friends and family, from your religion, you're in a situation which has no factor that everyone approves of. There's a gay or lesbian husband involved. You're living with a gay, you haven't left your husband who's gay or your wife who's lesbian, and you're in a non-traditional, usually, relationship, so that they're not all, there's some of these couples are monogamous, but some will have an outside partner who's secondary. So lack of positive support. Very few mentioned homophobia. They just said lack of support, lack of role models, lack of positive messages. This is one of the reasons I want to do this research, so we can get across the idea it is possible to stay married. It isn't the thing to do for everybody, but it is possible. Okay, what advice? The fourth question I asked was advice, because oftentimes people will say this and that, but it's really what advice they give to other couples who are facing this that makes the difference. Lesbian and bi women and their husbands, communication, support groups, honesty, and take your time. Counseling seemed to be, the husbands of lesbians and lesbians said counseling, seek a good counselor, suggesting that there's very little counseling for bisexual wives and their husbands. The bisexual and lesbian wives both said, be caring to your husband and be committed to the relationship. The husbands didn't mention that. That's a gender thing, I think, and which is why we have to keep teasing out the gay factor from all these things and just look at them for that. Women care and may pay more attention to that, and therefore when the gay and bisexual husbands come out, the women want to be cared for. They want to feel the commitment. They want to feel the love, because that's what they're used to, and gives them security. Bisexual gay husbands and their wives, their advice was, the bisexual husbands, interestingly enough, more of them said, understand your wife's needs. And make sure the wife understands your needs. The understanding of needs, they advised. They found very little peer support, so they didn't recommend it. More of them said, take your time. The wives of gays, fewer of them said communication, suggesting that it wasn't that helpful, but you try it, but it wasn't that helpful. And I'm not saying gay husbands aren't good at communicating. I'm just saying this is what the wives were saying would be for advice. And the wives of bis and bis husbands, more of them said communication and work together. But altogether, the bisexual and gay husbands and their wives, communication, therapy, love, time, honesty, and space for each other. I'm really so amazed reading these open-ended answers on how these couples worked together and felt they were all alone in the world doing it. And the craving for peers, this is why I think the group you have here in Houston is so wonderful. There are couples there. They're craving for role models to find out how other people did it, to see, you can come out all right, you can work it out. And several of the group, I overheard the small groups this morning, as the wife becomes, or the person to whom the other one comes out, becomes more of a person and reclaims his or her identity and becomes stronger and more expressive and more able to communicate the needs, the better couple it is anyway, whether or not you stay together. The more you have, I think, a closer bond than most heterosexual marriages, because you've worked through such tremendously profound differences. What I'd like to do now is read you just samples of couples and their decisions from those who separated, but there was with a positive relationship to those who stayed married, and then we will have time for questions before we break. Before I do that, though, there's a particular coping strategy in here that I think I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on. And that is, when I first started doing these interviews, the thing that struck me was everyone was so flexible and resilient. Well, very few people mentioned that when they looked back in their lives. But they did mention openness and attention and things like that. So I put together a little scheme that would be very helpful. Being open is something you can decide to be. The next step is whether you can be flexible enough to try out what you're open to. It's very different, very different. You can be open in the world, but are you going to dare try A, B? A, if it doesn't work, then try B, and then try C. And are you strong enough in your own self-esteem to know that if A fails, you'll pick yourself up and try B. If that fails, you try something else and try something else. So the openness, then the flexibility. And it's very, very interesting if you think about it. So it's much better to be open than to be rigid, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you can take that step. Many people are open to the ideas, but they cannot allow an outside, they can't share their husband with somebody else or their wife. They're open to the idea. I mean, they'll think about it. They won't turn it off, but they just can't do that. Or they try it. Now, I have a wife in my support group, and her husband came out after being somewhat closeted about it as bisexual, and he wanted to go to the sexual massage parlor. She said, oh, okay, try it. Well, he went. He came home, said he had a good time, never went again. She was open to have him try it. He tried it. If she'd said no, he probably would have wanted to go and done it on the side. But letting the exploration happen makes it, they understand it. I don't want to do it, or I do want to do it. He just has some bisexual friends he plays cards with once a week now. That's all he needs. They have, however, the circumstances that some of you in the room don't have, which is a marriage of 30 years behind them, a grown son, now a grandchild, and the family history and those circumstances play a lot of role into it. If you have minor children, you have to consider them. Okay. This is from a journal. The range of people that I've talked to now who have been married run from 19, coming out 19 to 70 something. Most of those who have maintained their marriages that I've been surveying run from about 28 to 75. Most of them are 30, 40, or 50, which I think probably covers everyone in the room. I don't know. So this is the youngest couple. And they had decided that once they had their friendship was threatened, they would separate. But they had alternative plans. He was to move down the street. Children would run back and forth between the houses. They had it all, the scenario all written, if it got to be such a point that they couldn't. So July 2nd, which was probably a year after he came out, as their second child was born, she writes in her journal, "There's never been a perfect time, but now's the time to separate. The resentment between Dave and me has been building. Today in therapy, I realized I had to get over with. Dave's uncle, meanwhile, was calling us chicken for putting it off. We'll separate after vacation before the girls start school so they won't have too much to cope with all at once." It is so lonely at the moment, but not forever. It makes me feel better to remember that I still have my bond with Dave, which we vowed would be forever. So that's one kind of ending. Then we have the story in here of Siri and Jerry. He's bi. He had affairs all through their marriage. She didn't realize it. He was a minister. The thing that kind of broke the straw was when he was coming home after had been arrested once in a men's room, and he was coming home from something or other through the park, and somebody called him from the bushes, and of course it was an undercover cop, so he ended up in jail. But she went through all of this, but she knew she needed to live with him, and in the meantime got herself teaching piano and building her own life. The end of her story, what she says, is they are still together. He has his own little bi life. She has her life. She got her master's degree. But at the end of her story, I want you to read what she says. "Somehow Jerry and I had lost touch with each other before he came out. Because of the experience, the relationship is better and we're both stronger. I no longer wish he weren't bi. His gay side makes him who he is. It's also how I got to know the gay parents group, the most genuine people I know. We can be ourselves with them. They know exactly who we are. We don't have to hide." Which is another plug for a kind of a support group that you all have, because you can be who you are in front of yourself. Okay. Then we have someone whose husband did not want to stay. And she ends up her story saying, "While I was still anxious that too much time had been lost in my sexual life for any straight male to want me as a lifelong mate." Very clever. As a lifelong mate, a new bond was developing with a caring, accepting, spiritual lover who made me feel fulfilled as a complete woman, false and all. And that's one of the interesting things that happens to this. As the straight spouse goes through self-search to figure out what to do, you find a whole bunch of faults that you realize are part of you. You don't have to be the straight spouse anymore, and you can admit them and not become defensive, and be honest and be present for your spouse. And that also is to admit your own faults is a fine way to get the relationship going, because then it really is unconditional love. That Christmas night I wrote in my journal, whatever uncertainties of life lie ahead for me in the new year, I feel confident that I can meet and overcome any obstacle or challenge in my path. In my 57th year, I had come of age. And that's what this crisis really does. If you can get through this, you can get through anything. Then we have a couple, the man had led a gay life, decided he didn't like the gay lifestyle, was bisexual enough, he fell in love with a woman, and they got married, but she kept worrying about it. It took a while for us to write this script for ourselves. We've survived 7 years of marriage by tolerating the ambivalence of what we are and the uncertainty of what could happen. It has always come back to our ability to communicate expectations and what our relationship means to us. When I have doubts or fears, or just tell Josh with no assumptions, no judgments, only the belief that he'll help. In turn, he's become less shy about sharing his fears and his thoughts. If Josh came to me now and said, I've decided to want to have sex with a man, would that mean the end of the relationship? No. In addition to a nice life and all the reasons anyone would stay in a marriage, I love him. Besides, I don't think that sex with a man would be a meaningful emotional experience for him now. If Josh decides someday that he doesn't want to be married, would I say it would have been a foolish error? No. We have a life together. He's the father of my child. My time with him is now. And then the last example is of Jane and Jim. And Jane is now, she's the famous lesbian Presbyterian minister who was not allowed to be a Presbyterian minister and is now kind of an advocate at large. And Jim is now president of the PFLAG of Santa Rosa. And he's one of the two spouses in this book who allowed his name to be used. The sum of all my efforts is focused on my family, he told me. Last Christmas, seated around our dining room table were Jimmy and Chet, his sons, Jackie's mother, he remarried Jackie, Jackie's mother, Jackie's son and his wife, my grandfather, Janie, her lover, her mother and father, all of us getting along fantastically. No matter what I think or don't think, Janie is always going to be a lesbian and the mother of my two boys. We may remain very close friends, arm in arm, for such a long time. So there are some examples of how people kept together one way or another. So are there any questions? We have a few minutes left for questions about this, how one does this.
Amity, if you were guessing at the single most prominent underlying motivation for wanting people to marry together, what would you think it is?
The primary motivation for staying together is the value of the marriage to them.
What does that mean?
It means that they analyze the marriage and is it worthwhile, their relationship, their togetherness, their being together, their
They want that.
is enough to fight for. That seems to be the single most motive, enough for them to fight for it. And they really feel they have to fight for it. They have to fight family, friends, church, the statistics, lack of role models, everything they grew up to believe and not to believe.
The institution of the marriage or caring for
No, their marriage. There's only one person that mentioned concept of marriage. The rest said, the coping, here you ask a question, what is the most effective coping strategy? We have a great marriage. It's their teamwork, us. As somebody said, it's us. Does that answer your question? What do they mean by marriage?
She reveals the world.
Beg your pardon? The thing that came through the strongest was when I said what circumstances, asked what circumstances facilitated it, they said very few. It was us. We did it. And it takes a great deal of creativity. You have to rewrite your own rules, your own script, your own bottom lines, your own boundaries. I didn't mention that as part of communication, is communicating your boundaries, which can be not boundaries of what your husband or wife can do away from the home, but boundaries of what you can tolerate. I mean, some wives won't want to hear, just want to say, okay, you're going to the bars, don't tell me anything more. Others will say, tell me everything. So as our friend back there says, it depends on the individuals, the couple relationship, pretty much, period. Except some places it's easier to do it than others. It's harder to do it in the Bible Belt than in Germany, where homosexuality is pretty well tolerated, in Berlin particularly.
It seems to me that the move is from conditional love to unconditional love. Is that what you said?
The question was, is it a move from conditional love to unconditional love? It is a move, and sometimes it is not a move as much as realizing that's what it is. One of the things which is not up there, which is acceptance. Acceptance to the wife, the straight spouse, is a coping strategy. Acceptance to the gay, lesbian, or bisexual spouse is a circumstance. The wife has to cope in order to finally accept, but without the straight spouse's acceptance, it's more difficult for the gay or lesbian or bisexual person to feel comfortable in who he's supposed to be. So when you see all these things written down, acceptance, who's accepting? And it works the other way around. The gay, lesbian, bisexual spouse has to accept the hurt, accept the fact that it's going to hurt, accept the fact that your husband or wife is not going to be tickled pink over it, but you accept it. You see, that's the part of respecting. It's not going to be, no marriage is perfect anyway. This is just a very severe difference. Sorry about that, Don. You thought you had a perfect marriage. You had a question, I think. Did you?
I was trying to formulate a couple of them. Have you run into the demon of I've been betrayed that just hangs on?
Have I run into the
I
demon?
can't let go of that because I didn't do anything wrong.
Absolutely. Have I run into the demon of being betrayed? That's that business this morning I went into, is getting stuck. A small minority, but a very vocal minority of straight spouses continually to feel betrayed. And their husbands were not very nice, actually. They were out getting sexual transmitted STDs and infecting their wives, and they were blaming their wives, and they were telling the children it was the wife's fault. So they have every reason to be angry, but there's nothing they can much do about it, but they do get stuck and feel betrayed.
And then there's we haven't talked much about this, but it shows up a lot, and that is just the violence, and the hatred, and the splitting up, and destroying everything just to, I don't know, try to save yourself or hurt the other person. Or like, so many aren't able to be friends.
The question is, the other concern besides betrayal is the violence that can happen between couples that can affect their children. It's the other side of the coin of my saying the couples have to do this alone, because the straight community does not support these couples. The lesbian and gay community does not support these couples. Many women in the lesbian community are old-timer, militant feminists who don't want anything to do with the patriarchal society or men to be involved in their lives. And a lot of lesbians, they struggle. They're being pressured by people to do certain things they know they don't want to do with their husbands.
It has to be us, doesn't it?
And so it's just very hard not to. Now, I would hope the courts, I've just finished this chapter, as I said, on custody, and I would hope the courts will start paying attention to the children. Children need their fathers and their mothers, no matter what sexual orientation. And you can't get the fathers out of those children's lives. So, yes, I have run into it, and it's very sad. It's sad for the children and sad for the fathers. There's one man in my group, and his wife is a Native American, and she took the children away to the Indian Territory so that he could not reach them by the federal law, because they're safe there from the federal law. So I think he saw them 2 weeks in 1 year. He raised them the first 3 or 4 years of their life. He was the at-home parent. I'm hoping this will change, because we have to remember that people who choose to be parents are a different kind of person. Really, if you want to have children and you take the responsibility for them for 18 years and 9 months, you vest a lot of interest in that, and so it has no reason to be a political football or get affected by larger social political issues. Does that answer your question, sort of? Or make it worse?
I just keep hoping that things like this, and groups working on it like this group is working on it, will offer people an alternative to all that fighting. And as you mentioned, these different groups that do not support, the word is, get you a lawyer. And when you do that,
That's right.
you are fighting. And,
Well,
it's support is not there anywhere.
No, and we've been working, PFLAG started this support group network in 1986. Now that's 13 years ago. We're only up to 35 or 40 support groups in this country. People don't know about it. People will stumble upon it and say, oh, isn't that nice? We can't get the word out for people to know there is support so that people can learn alternatives. Because it's hard to do this alone without support groups.
There's also the many faces of denial. There's so many faces you get to where you don't think you understand it at all, because it shows up in I guess that's what it is, because somebody will tell you that you're in denial. It's easy to say whether it's true or not, but denial is a strange, many-faceted thing.
What kind of, we're talking about denial. What kind of denial?
Denial of the fact
Yes.
that it's really true, it's just a bad dream, it'll go away. Or the kind of information that people have had, maybe it's a phase, it's when you're operating with that information it's not true, then I guess denial is...
Talking about denial is you don't want to, most of these couples married because they were best friends and on a basis of love. You don't want to admit you hurt your wife, and you don't want to tell the person that you love that they hurt you. You don't want to admit pain, so it's easier to deny. But what the couples have come through to me often enough is by not denying and being honest about it, the love really carries you through it. So we have to educate somehow that it is possible. I mean, this is what the message I'd like everyone to leave with. This is a unique situation. There are many ways to resolve it. There are plenty of positive options out there. It can be done, but we need to educate people out there that it's okay to be in a mixed orientation marriage. marriages.
It's dawning on people.
It's dawning, but it's a slow dawn. Really.
7 or 8 groups and 15 groups in the nation.
Well, we grew, but the groups never. What we need to do is, once spouses get themselves together, either separate, divorce, or decide they're going to stay married, this is no longer an issue. They move on. So we have to start a whole new support group. And so this is the frustration I have as director of this thing, is that we don't have any ongoing support, so that when Jackie burns out and Sarah burns out, and Lord knows you've been doing this since 1986, I'm sure, if not before, when you burn out, who's going to take your place? So if you're gay, you're always gay. If you're straight, you're always straight, but you're not. If you're in mixed orientation marriage, that's not supposed to be a big issue. So you can't, what can you advocate, except we can advocate one thing, that people can be who they are and have their romances and have their teenage flings and have their children without dragging people into a false situation.
Another word is the word bisexual. The first group that formed here in Houston had a large number of people, 24 in it, and they were
He's talking.
angry at one couple who wanted to stay together. They really jumped on them. And they said he claimed to be bisexual, and they said to him, a bisexual person is a gay person in denial. That my psychiatrist says there's probably no such thing, but somehow there's got to be that kind of being there to explain some of the variations in this. So now it comes on as maybe a large group of people. So it's a tremendous learning curve you go on, trying just to understand what the facts are here and what the possibilities are.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up bisexuality, because that is very difficult. There are many kinds of bisexual. Some bisexual women, for example, figure out, well, they're really lesbian. Some lesbians figure out, I'm really bisexual. Some bisexuals go back to being straight. It's all a whole gamut of things. Probably the best book on it is The Bisexual Option by Fritz Klein, where they have 7 different dimensions of sexuality, and past, present, and your ideal. So you've got 21 things to play with. We're all a mixture. The problem is that I think, in my humble opinion, that there is such a thing in this country, this identity thing, whether it's race or religion or sexual orientation, that some gay men say they feel betraying their community if they say they're bisexual or love a woman. And that's why I don't like to deal with labels. So I'm married and I'm happy with this person and I also love men. Or I'm married and I'm happy with this person but I also love women. It's much easier that way, and I think we trip ourselves up. And I think the gay and lesbian and bisexual communities suffer if they can't see themselves as all part of one sexual kind of group. If you want to define yourself by sexual orientation, I mean, it's overemphasizing something which is core to us, but not the only thing.
One of the problems of the bisexual is PFLAG likes to say it's not a choice. But here stands this bisexual, and sometimes it looks like it's a pretty large group that can make a choice.
That's right.
Not about their orientation.
Right.
But about which one they will participate in or not.
Well, even a gay person can make a choice how they're going to express and how they're going to live. I mean, you can't change your orientation, but you can make a choice on how you're going to live with it, what you're going to do with it, how you're going to treat other people because of it. And so for this whole middle, so the research says that for this whole middle ground, sexuality is very fluid. I mean, there are some exclusively heterosexual people and some exclusively gay and lesbian. But the latest research says the exclusive ones are minuscule, not the straight ones, of course, but of the gay, they say now is perhaps, with the latest random standard sampling, is maybe 2%, taking everybody, which includes 9% of those who live in the cities and 1% of those who live in the country. It all depends where you live. So it is confusing, and that's why it makes more sense for couples to deal with themselves and what works.
It's confusing for PFLAG, who's on everybody's side. But that makes it absolutely impossible for the general public to deal with. They can say whatever they want to about it and prove it's true with some of these people.
Yep. What's your answer? What's your solution to accepting all sexual diversity?
Well, it's a great enterprise. It's just going to take a little longer than we thought, because you can't be clear about who you're talking about. Someone can say, this gay person got into a religious program and got healed. Well, you run that through what I've come to understand. You say, well, a person could do that and look like they've changed their sexual orientation, which hasn't happened. But that doesn't carry much weight when you're trying to talk with someone about that. So they keep rejecting and being hateful about it. It's going to take us a long time both to understand ourselves as well as communicate what the truth that shows up really is to the world. And we've got to do that to stop some of this hatefulness.
We have to stop the hatefulness and a lot of it, this ignorance and fear that, you fear, so you put up walls, and you ignore, so you just put labels on it to get it out of your way and sort it out and put it in your drawer and close it. But the business of the religious right, and Masters and Johnson even, saying that they change people. Well, they change the behavior. And that's just fine. And my feeling is there's always going to be a bunch of extremists. And if you can speak their language and not be hateful in return, if you be hateful in return, they get more. I think one of the reasons they're more intense right now is because we're getting more successful. And there are fewer of them, and they're making more noise. But one of the best conversations I've had was a person who was very high up in the Family Research Council, because we had the same basis, but then he went with it in a different direction. So, but if you can establish communication and just sort of talk person to person, I think that's the only way I can handle it. But we can't demonize them, as Carver says, because that starts wars. But it'll take time. Do you have any other questions? Yes?
How was it that you said a little bit earlier about it being open is a choice, or it's something you decide to be, but being flexible is...
You have to act.
You have to act to be flexible. And I was thinking as you were talking about
the question was, what's the difference between being open and being flexible? Being open is, okay, you decide, okay, I'll be open. And then being flexible is you could decide that you can try this option.
Okay. Well, people, if you were talking about the marriages of the gay and the straight, they have to figure out a flexible marriage, is what I was thinking.
If they want to stay together, they have to figure.
And people need to be more flexible in how they look at what marriage is. The fundamentalists are so wild-eyed about a same-sex marriage, and yet they think that it is just horrible that they're out there having sex without being in the sacred bond of marriage, and they won't allow them to have it. If we could be flexible enough to think that being with somebody is a sacred partnership, and let's honor that. And I don't know how we can get people to be more flexible and open.
The question is, how do you get other people to be more flexible? Well, my feeling is you've got to start to get them more open to the possibilities if there are other possibilities.
gay or lesbians process in the coming out where they inform the spouse influence how the couple deals with the
Good question. How does the process of coming out
Right, how's
affect
it
the
going?
result, the consequences? Well, you don't leave a net letter next to the cup of coffee of your spouse when you go off to work. One of the pieces of advice that one of the men had in his questionnaire was prepare. Have books ready. Go to a neutral space. And if at all possible, if you can do it, come out as soon after you come out to yourself, or at least before you start acting on it. Because let's face it, the real problem for most of these spouses is that period of time when you're out there exploring and the deceit and the hiding. It seems to happen less often with lesbians than gay or bisexual, but I don't know. I haven't interviewed nearly enough to guess, but it's the deceit, it's the deception, it's the feeling stupid, it's feeling that you can't trust your own judgment. That's worse than the actual coming out. But the coming out, there's a wonderful book called Coming Out with Love by Roy Eichberg, which I just love, and that's basically he's writing a letter and being there when they read it. A husband came out to their children. He wrote the letter, gave it to the children in his study, and the wife was outside so that they could read it, talk with him, go to her, go back and forth for the children part. But it does make a difference. I'm sure you did it just fine.
What I was more worried about or thinking about was the sooner that the spouse knows, because the gay person goes through a coming out process too.
Absolutely.
And if you're going out, and the straight spouse has their own coming out, if you go through the steps together, does it work better for keeping the marriage together than if one is further along in the process?
The question is, does the coming out make it easier or harder when they do it for the marriage to stay together? It really doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. Some spouses say, I wish my husband had been clearer about it because I don't like this up and down. One day he's this way, and one day he's that way. One day she wants to stay, and the next day she wants to go. The confusion is hard on it, but you are doing it together. And if you're committed, so far, there's no one way or the other. Couples who have divorced have many of these same coping strategies that they use to try to make it together. But just being honest and open, that's the other kind of openness. It's just being open by being honest. Are you looking at your clock for a reason? Okay. One more question, and then we're going to have an interesting little dialogue. You can have lots of questions. So there are possibilities, there are options, there are many ways to do it.
What's a good way to get the dialogue started? What's a positive way to ask the questions to get the information? I always find that, if I say, well, what have you been thinking about? That's a challenge, that's a threat. And
The question is, how do you start the dialogue? One of the things, of course, we find out that in this is that if you've got good dialogue to begin with, this will carry you through with this. But in many cases, you have to learn. Good thing is to go to a counselor who can be the mediator in the beginning and show you how. But head-on questions are a threat, and people do close up. Once you get going, you can set the check-in time and let him ask the question first.
I guess the next question is, how do you find the counselor?
How do you find the counselor?
Because there are plenty of counselors who say, oh, yeah, I can handle this, and they can't handle that.
No. I think I know people who know them in Manhattan, for example, and I know a good one.
Good. I'll check it.
Why don't we stop now so that we could get organized for the next one? But just know that it is possible to remain friends.
Our group decided we needed to charge you with the responsibility of preparing some dialogue skits or expressions that could be available to people after they've known that they have an issue here to deal with, of how to deal with it, because some words are dangerous
Mm,
And ways of saying things matter.
great idea.
And so why don't you get running?
All right,
that?
I've been charged. All right, I've been charged to write a script, a dialogue of getting things started. And pass it out tomorrow, right. Hopefully some of that'll be in this chapter. Thank you. We'll see you in 5 minutes in a circle.